Hi, I'm Billy Hollowell, and welcome to Answering Atheists, a Pure Talk series brought to you by pureflix.com. I am here today with Emeal ZWayne, President of Living Waters. How you doing?
Doing great. Great to be here with you, looking out and seeing this view and just getting blown away again.
It's so cool that it doesn't look real.
It doesn't look real, and I'll tell you, I've seen it a number of times, but each time I see it, it's like seeing it for the first time.
It's like a painting.
I just get blown away. I know.
Yeah, it's
amazing.
Incredible inside too. I mean, that's the thing. The outside is one thing. You get in there, it's a whole other.
Mind
right?
blowing.
So you have this incredible story, and I've had a chance to tell this story before and talk to you about it. But one of the things when we talk about atheism and when I interact with atheists, they often ask for evidence. You know, what's the evidence of belief? And you know, you can have that debate all day long, but the thing for me that I've always found the most compelling are the stories of people like you who go from point A to point Z. Something happens in their life, and it's an encounter, that thing with Christ. And so I guess we could start at the beginning of your story if you want to just take us through your testimony.
Yeah. Well, you know, years ago I summed up my testimony in this little verse, and it goes like this. I once was but a lump of coal upon a heap of mire, yet Jesus Christ redeemed my soul and saved me from the fire. So that's my testimony in a nutshell, basically. I once was blind, but now I see. I was lost, now I'm found. I was born in Lebanon back in 1975, and my family immigrated to the U.S. in 1980. And you know, growing up in a war-torn country, I had this little chip on my shoulder from the outset. So I'm in this new culture, don't speak the language, don't know how to conduct myself really in this new sort of dynamic. And so even from kindergarten, I was a little rebel. I was stealing from little cubby holes, I was getting in fights, and just really going down a wrong road. I had a little reformation when I was about 8 years old. I did my first Holy Communion in the Catholic Church and thought, now I'm gonna be a good kid. I'm going to live the good life. I made my long list of do's and don'ts, things I'd always do, things I'd always avoid. But as I started to progress through the stages of adolescence and then into junior high, high school, that long list of do's and don'ts became a distant memory. The sin nature was radically manifesting itself in me. I was the poster boy for the sin nature. If there was any doubt the sin nature existed, I was living proof. And so by the time I had hit high school, things really started to spiral out of control. I had a hunger for popularity, a hunger for fame. At that time, I was my class president, but I didn't do it because I was concerned that our class needed good leadership. I just wanted to sit on the throne and rule. Exactly. I wanted to be king easy, you know. But again, being after the wrong things, I started getting into fights and caused trouble and really have a hard time with just teachers and things like that. And so by the end of that freshman year, I was expelled from my first high school.
Wow.
Sent to my second high school my sophomore year, and at this time, believe it or not, I was a rap artist. I had gotten connected with some of the top producers in the industry who produced some of the top artists in the industry. And so at 15 years old, I had my artist-producer contract signed. I was on my way to the big time, and yet I had this rebellious streak in me to where power was important. So at that second school I was at, by the end of that sophomore year, I had now become not only a guy who was kicked out of 2 high schools, but I had become a gang member with the Crips. And it all culminated one day when I tried to commit suicide in front of my family because of where I was. You know, it looked like I had it together on the outside, but internally I was falling apart. I was battling my own demons, so to speak, as a sin nature was overtaking me in every way. And so in the midst of all that, a good friend of mine invited me to an event called the Harvest Crusade. I went with him.
Greg Laurie.
That's right. Went with him that night and almost didn't go. You know, I was at home, told my mom, I'm going to some Christian thing with my friend tonight. She said, yeah, right, you liar. I'm thinking, this is the first time in my life I tell her the truth. She's not believing me. And so anyhow, my friend gets there. I was really upset and angry. I was going to go and take off and do what my mom thought I was going to do. I was going to go drink and party. But I get in my friend's car. We drive over to the crusade. And I remember I get out of the car. I'm walking in. I'm still angry. But I walk in and I look around. I see this amphitheater filled with people, over 20,000 people there that night. And as I was sitting there and the worship started and I'm looking around, I'm seeing these people worshiping God, looking up toward the heavens, raising their hands. And I thought, man, these guys are acting as if though God is like here or something. Little did I know he was, you know. And so I remember Greg Laurie got up and he began to preach the gospel. And it was the first time in my life that I understood the cross. You know, I grew up, like I said, going to church all my life, and I'd see Jesus on that crucifix, but I never understood the significance of it. And suddenly I came face to face with the reality of my sinfulness. Because, you know, we as people compare ourselves to others often. The guy smoking weed thinks he's okay because he's comparing himself to the guy who slams heroin.
Right.
The guy who slams heroin says, hey, I'm a good guy, at least I'm not hurting anyone. He's a rapist. The rapist will point to the murderer. Even the murderer will say, hey, at least I'm not like Adolf Hitler or Mussolini,
right,
who murdered millions of people. But I came to realize, man, God's going to judge me by his own standard. I violated his holy law. By that standard, I'm a liar, I'm a thief. If I've looked with lust, I'm an adulterer. If I've had unjust anger or hatred in my heart, I'm considered a murderer. And I'm in big trouble. I'm not just this good guy because I haven't done what other people have done. And I owe a debt to justice. And then when he preached the gospel that Christ came, died for my sins, took my place on the cross, rose again on the third day, and he was willing to save me as a free gift of his grace. That's what blew my mind, that I could know there and then that I was forgiven of my sins and that I had everlasting life because of what Christ did, that he would impute to me his perfect righteousness apart from anything that I could ever do. And so when that invitation was given, I was probably the first person in that place to jump up. I ran forward, cried out.
Was your friend shocked?
My friend was shocked. He, you know, wasn't expecting that was going to happen. And so when he saw me respond, he was blown away. And I'll tell you, Billy, it was instantaneous, not days or hours or minutes or seconds later. It was radical transformation. Like the Bible says, you know, if any man is in Christ, he's a new creation. The old things have passed away, all things have become new.
So you went from all of those things, the muck and the, you know, the gang, all of that.
Yeah.
Instantly realizing it's wrong. And do you think you knew in your heart, you know, even before that what you were doing was wrong?
Sure.
Or?
I knew it was wrong, but again, I downplayed it because I would compare myself to others. But I came face to face with the severity of my sin, but then I was just absolutely blown away by the grace of God, that though I was such a sinner, though I was such a wretch who was justly deserving of God's wrath, who truly deserved God's judgment in hell forever, that God's love was so great, he was willing to become a part of his creation and then take my place on that cross and endure the wrath of God that I deserved and to shed his blood so that I can have forgiveness of sins.
And so you change instantaneously, and this is the proof that I talk about. I mean, millions upon millions of people having the same story or a similar story, things you can't even imagine, and they change, and they are new people entirely.
Yeah.
And so you encounter these atheists who are like, well, where's your evidence? It's like, well, hello. I mean, look around you. When you hear these stories, and they will dismiss that, and you know, and this kind of leads us into some of the things, you know, the gotcha questions that atheists will have, right? And one of those gotcha questions is, you know, slavery, right? So we get into this issue of slavery. Well, the Bible endorses slavery, and they start to pull out verses and you know, obey your masters and all of that. Can you speak to that at all?
Sure, I'd love to speak to that. Well, you know, one of the first questions I like to ask atheists who are questioning me on moral issues, especially those in the Bible, is first of all, do you believe in moral absolutes? And if you're a true atheist, you're going to say, no, of course not. Morality is relative, and it's determined by the individual, or it's determined by society. And so when they respond that way, I say, then what's the problem with slavery? Why do you have such a problem with slavery if morality is relative and it's dependent on the individual or the society? Well, then they'll go to, well, it's society. Our society has determined that. Well, yeah, well, what about when society functioned in a way that the majority said that slavery was acceptable? What about that? Would that not make then those abolitionists who rose up and said we need to do away with slavery, wouldn't that make them immoral because now they're at odds with the social norm? They have a hard time with that, right? And let me just say this, Billy, I love atheists. Atheists oftentimes think that Christians hate them and we've got an axe to grind. The furthest thing from the truth, right? I mean, we love atheists and we want them to come to the knowledge of the truth just as God has brought us to it. So that's my response on that front. But if we were to dive deeper into it and answer it in connection with what Scripture teaches, first of all, it's important to understand that at the very bare minimum, let's say that slavery wasn't ideal, but it did exist, and we see it in the Bible. First of all, we have to understand that there's a difference between sanctioning something or approving of something and regulating something. We see an example of that, for example, in Matthew chapter 19, where Jesus was talking about divorce. And they asked him, well, wait a minute. Moses said, give her a certificate of divorce and dismiss her and so on and so forth. He said, look, because of the hardness of your heart, God permitted that. But from the beginning, that was not so. So that's an example of God not condoning something per se or prescribing something. In fact, it tells us in Malachi, God hates divorce, but he regulated it, and it was in connection with the hardness of the hearts of men. So that's just one sense in saying that, let's say it wasn't ideal, but God decided to regulate it. You have that example. But the problem is when people speak about slavery, they're often thinking of it in the context of the 18th, 19th century West African slave trade, where people were kidnapped, taken captive against their will, brought to new nations, treated subhuman, in fact, considered in some instances by law as not being human, mistreated, subjugated, involuntarily. That's what we think of when we think of slavery. But you have to understand, in the biblical context, that wasn't what was going on. And another aspect of the slavery we see in those contexts is that it was racially based. That wasn't the case in biblical times. In fact, in Exodus chapter 21, we see that kidnapping and selling people was a crime punishable by death. So we're talking about two different things. We're talking about a system under which there was an economic mechanism available to those who wanted to get out of debt. And so there was that aspect of it where it was voluntary servitude, so to speak. And even in the biblical context, you'll see prescribed to the children of Israel under a theocratic system, and let me make that clear, that basically they would serve under terms where they would be a servant for about 6 years, and then they'd be set free on the 7th year. And then they had the opportunity, if they wanted to continue with their master. And so it's important to understand that. It wasn't racially based, it was voluntary in most cases. Of course, you had slavery in the context of war to keep those that were vanquished from rebellion and so forth. And so it's important to understand it in those different contexts. And people were able to come out of that sort of arrangement as well.
And then you have Philemon, and you have obviously you have
Philemon, Paul telling him to treat him as a brother,
exactly,
and so on and so forth. And so and look, even if you look at Deuteronomy 23, you see a context there where if a slave leaves, flees from their master, presumably under abuse, that they're not to be returned to him, and they're not to be mistreated or oppressed. And so there's so many different things. There are regulations in there too for how a slave would be treated, and if they were abused, what the consequences would be for the master, and so on and so forth. So we just have to understand that these are different contexts, and we have to understand that the Bible is not primarily concerned with social reform. It's concerned with spiritual transformation, which often can have an impact on social reform, of course. But there are different situations and contexts that are different than the ones that we're in today. And also, this wasn't something that was prescribed as a mandatory thing for all nations. This was a theocracy. This was how God was regulating and dealing with his people at that time.
And they love to sort of seize on it because Leviticus and Deuteronomy are difficult books. There are things that are hard to understand. And so if you can say, well, God condoned this, this, and that, then the Bible's horrible and nobody should read it because these are horrible things.
Right.
And so you mentioned Deuteronomy 23. Deuteronomy 22 is where you have atheists pointing and saying, well, look, the Bible condones rape.
Yeah.
And so this is another tough one.
Sure.
So you want to speak to that one?
I would love to speak to that one. In fact, when you look closely at Deuteronomy 22, you realize that it has nothing to do with that at all. Of course, in the context there, you're looking at first God talking about any woman who is betrothed or married and who was forced into a sexual predicament. And the penalty for that was death. There was no question whatsoever. Then we get to the verses that you're referring to, and there we see the NIV translating that word there as rape. But if you look at most other translations, it gives the idea of laying hold of and lying with. And the words that are used there are used in other places where you don't have the context of rape going on. And if you notice in that verse, it says that if they are found out. So the perception is that this is talking about a woman who was raped, but when you look at the words that were used, when you look at the context of the entire thing, you come to realize that that's actually not what was going on, because it says they were found out. So what you have there is a situation of someone who was consensually entering into a sexual relationship with someone, and then they're discovered. And then in order to protect them in a social sense, this man now was obligated to pay the bride price, and then he was also obligated to take her as wife. But when you look at what I would call really almost a parallel passage in Exodus 21, it talks about that in there, but it talks about the father being willing to give her in marriage and that he could refuse that, and that was an option as well. So I think when you look at the whole context, you come to realize this isn't talking about rape. This is talking about consensual sex, but with an unmarried individual versus someone who was married and the death penalty was enforced for that. So you have a consensual sexual relationship between a young lady who's unmarried and a man, and now he not only has to do what's socially acceptable in that time and pay the bride price, marry her, of course, if the father's accepting, but he can never divorce her. So it's like, hey, suddenly paradigm shift, this guy's getting away with it. You could just go sleep with any lady, rape her, now, you know, and now she has to marry you. No, no, no. It's consensual, and now this guy doesn't get off the hook. He has to follow the social norms and be responsible. And if the father forbids it, then he can't marry her. If he does marry her, he can't even divorce her.
Well, this is why you need so much context and understanding
Sure.
you know, of all of this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the big things that atheists also struggle with when it comes to the New Testament is why? Why, if God is God, why couldn't he have just forgiven sin? Why did he need to send Jesus and come into human form and die this bloody death on a cross? Why did all this have to happen? It seems so needless and silly. That's what they'll say.
Yeah. You know what blows me away, Billy, when people start to pose these things, which they would view as contradictions or as unreasonable or as illogical. Typically, they're doing it, again, from a naturalistic standpoint, which postulates that we're basically the byproducts of random chance. We live in an accidental universe, right? Where, again, morality is relative. Morality is relative until they don't like something, right? And so now they're talking about logic, they're talking about reason, they're talking about things that are untenable for them, and yet the question is how do you account in a naturalistic universe where everything is material in a sense, how do you account for transcendent laws of logic and reason and ethics and morality and so on and so forth? Well, the atheist can't, but the Christian can. So my answer to that question is, why would God have to? Well, the bottom line is that God reigns supreme. He's the creator of the heavens and the earth. And he made this universe, so he dictates how the universe functions. And God cannot violate his nature. God is a just God. And this is a validation of Christianity that demonstrates that it's not man-made. Because if it was man-made, it would be exactly like that. Okay, you've sinned, I forgive you, it's over. But God is just.
That's a good point.
Right? God is just. He must deal with sin. You should expect some complication with things that are transcendent and not man-made. And so the bottom line is that God is just. Because God is just, God must deal with sin. And at the same time, God is merciful. God is gracious. So how can he be both at the same time? Well, we find the culmination of that in the cross. God demonstrated his justice by punishing sin, by taking the sins of mankind and placing them on Christ, and then punishing those sins on Christ. The Bible says that he who knew no sin became sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So on the cross, he bore our sins. God demonstrated his justice. He didn't just wink at sin. He didn't just let it go and say, okay, no big deal, I'm just going to wipe it out. He dealt with it. And by the same token then, extended grace, because Christ took it in our place, so that now God can give us forgiveness, mercy, and grace. And Christ, having taken our sin, can now impute to us his perfect righteousness. So that when God sees us, he sees us clothed in Christ, and that allows us now to enter his kingdom.
Wow, that's a great response to it, right? So the last question now, and this is another one of those difficult gotcha questions,
Sure.
would be the stoning issue, right?
Sure.
That, in the Old Testament, how does a loving God who's consistent in love across, because
Right.
they see, a lot of atheists see God as this angry, mean monster in the Old Testament,
Yeah.
and suddenly kind of a nice guy in their eyes, in
Yeah.
the New Testament. But the idea of stoning people for different things, children who don't behave,
Sure.
lots of different issues.
Yeah.
Why was that okay then? Why is that not okay now?
Absolutely.
And so what would you
Sure.
speak to that?
Well, again, I would remind everyone that when you're reading the Old Testament, you're reading laws that were prescribed to a theocratic nation. God was establishing a nation, and as its ruler, he was prescribing laws under which it was to be governed. Now, it's important to understand that that's not something that is prescribed for the world at large. And in fact, under the New Testament era, we recognize that we're no longer under law. And so it's important to see that in the law, you had the ceremonial aspect of the law, you had the civil aspect of the law, and you had the moral aspect of the law. Now, we could look at certain moral aspects of the law, such as the sin of homosexuality, the sin of adultery, bestiality is dealt with in there. You have all sorts of things that are covered. Now, those cross over, and those are for all time and for all people. Now, sometimes you have some crossover with the moral and the civil, the punishments that were prescribed by God under that theocratic rule. And so that was completely acceptable. See, the problem, Billy, is that people want to create God in their own image. That's the first and greatest sin, right? We want to create God in our own image and then judge God on the basis of that image we've created. God is God. He rules in the heavens, and he cannot violate his nature. So yes, in that time, God's prescribed punishment for homosexuality and a whole other host of sins was capital punishment. And it was perfect, it was holy, and it was just. And it was a manifestation of his love, because love cannot tolerate wickedness. All of us would look at a judge today who would look at massive crimes committed by someone and see that judge rule with judgment and punishment. We would look at that and say, yeah, that's a good judge. But on the flip side, if we were to see a judge look at someone who committed crimes and say, you know what, I'm a good, loving judge, so I'm gonna let that person go. We'd say, that's not a good and loving judge. That's a corrupt judge, because a good and loving judge would see to it that justice is done. And so under the New Testament era, we even see as a point to make that wasn't the mindset. You could look at, for example, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, where it talks about who the people that Paul is addressing were before they came to Christ. And in there, he deals with homosexuality and other sins. And then he says, and such were some of you. He's not saying, look, you committed these sins, so now we need to stone you, because he understands the context and the purpose of the law under that theocratic rule. And so I see no contradiction there whatsoever. You see a sovereign, supreme God who was dealing with sin as he saw fit, and it was perfectly just. Because how do we determine justice, again, without an ultimate authority, without transcendent moral values? And where do you get those in a random accident chance universe?
And once Christ came, you had this difference where the moral law seems to carry over.
Exactly.
But the civil and ceremonial passes
That's
away.
right. Absolutely. Right. Those served their purpose for the nation of Israel, but the moral law of God transcends that and is for all people and for all time.
Well, thank you. You tackled a bunch of the most difficult got you questions, and I appreciate that.
It's a pleasure. And again, we can fight against God all that we want. It's kind of like a person denying the existence of air while they draw it into their lungs to do so. You cannot have any standard by which to judge what is just, what is right, what is good without God. He is the ultimate authority. Otherwise, if it's relative, anything goes, and you can't say anything really.
Well, someone tweeted at me the other day, an atheist, and they said, well, I'm going to raise my kids to be good people, and and you're going to see. And it's like, well, you'll be doing that based on his standard, to a degree, on standards that have been set up in culture. If you go that route that God gave you, so you're kind of using his, you're denying that he's there, but you're kind of using some of the things that he gave you, because like you're saying, what is right and wrong, right?
Exactly.
Without a source of it.
Right. You have to have a transcendent authority, or else you're the authority. And if you're the authority, everyone can be their own authority.
Which is terrifying.
Which is very terrifying.
But that's what's happening in culture right now.
Absolutely.
That's what we're watching happen in front of us right now. It's only just starting.
Right.
So,
just the beginning, and we're seeing it, and it's manifesting itself in the most insane, unthinkable ways that people decades ago would have said no way. But
5 years ago, they might have said no way.
True. But because of the logic, it's happening, and you have to let it happen. Otherwise, now you're contradicting yourself.
Well, and you've got Generation Z, the most destitute, depressed, medicated, and these are kids.
Right.
Disconnected, detached generation yet, and a good chunk of that, you wonder, is that coming from the worldview that we're delivering to them and giving them?
Yeah,
so.
It is, absolutely. Ideas have consequences. And as Christ said, when you know the truth will set you free.
Well, thank you, Easy. This has been great.
It's been a pleasure.
Everyone else out there, be sure to go to pureflix.com and facebook.com/pureflix for more daily inspiring content.
With over 10,000 titles, it would be impossible for us to show you everything on pureflix.com. But let's give it a shot.